Chapter 11. The Christians, the Jews, and the Roman power. From Tiberius to Titus. At the time to which we are brought by the last chapter of Acts, there were Christian communities in all the great centres of population and in many of the towns and villages throughout the Roman world. The outward condition of these communities depended a great deal on the changing character and mood of the emperors, as well as of their servants and representatives in the provinces. In the first instance, the government concerned itself little with the professors of the new religion. For the Roman magistrate, the things which were chosen to bring to light the things that are were as good as non-existent, and sometimes, as in the well-known instance of Gallio, there was little disposition to interfere for the purpose either of persecuting or of protecting. Wherever the Christians were regarded as a Jewish sect, their assemblies belonged to the Collegia Licita. But where contempt exists, it may, with little provocation, with little cause, imaginary or real, pass into hatred. Tiberius, in whose reign Christ suffered, did not persecute the followers of Christ, and there even arose the legend that he proposed to the Senate to receive Christ among the gods. In the reign of Claudius, AD 53, Jews, we know, were banished from Rome as having been guilty of exciting a tumult, and it is not improbable that on that occasion Jews and Christians were confounded, although it is not clear from the words of Suetonius. Judeos impulsore Cresto, assidue tumultuantes, Roma expulit. The first horrible persecution of which the Christians were the victims broke out in the year 64 AD under Nero. But even he had let them alone during the first years of his reign. No one in these years could foresee the wild, voluptuous, and cruel career which he was afterwards to run. On that career, however, he was now running. It is noteworthy that the first great persecution to which the Christians were subjected was a mere incident and did not arise directly from religious hatred. He had murdered his mother, his wife, and his half-brother. It is not wonderful that his teachers, Burrus and the famous Seneca, met the same fate, 65 AD. The moralist had written that the world could not endure its evil, but there is nowhere a depth of evil so low that there cannot be found a lower still. In 64 AD, a fire raged in the capital. It was greater than any that had ever been known. The greater part of the city was destroyed. According to Gibbon, the vigilance of the government appears not to have neglected any of the precautions which might alleviate the sense of so dreadful a calamity. The imperial gardens were thrown open to the distressed multitude, temporary buildings were erected for their accommodation, and a plentiful supply of corn and provisions was distributed at a very moderate price. The most generous policy seemed to have dictated the edicts which regulated the disposition of the streets and the construction of private houses, and, as it usually happens, in an age of prosperity, the conflagration of Rome, in the course of a few years, produced a new city, more regular and more beautiful than the former. But all the prudence and humanity affected by Nero on this occasion were insufficient to preserve him from the popular suspicion. The voice of rumour accused the emperor as the incendiary of his own capital. The act with which he had been charged has been differently explained. One account was that he set fire to the city in order to feast his eyes with a spectacle that would realise to his mad fancy the burning of Troy, and that, while the flames were ascending, he declaimed from the Iliad. But this Gibbon characterises as one of the incredible stories that are adapted to the genius of an enraged people. Another account, which cannot be characterised in the same way, is that he intended to erect on the scene of ruin and desolation new buildings, and especially a magnificent imperial palace. At all events, suspicion had fastened on him, and he might well apprehend fatal consequences if he could not succeed in averting it. He must roll it off on those who were accused of cherishing such a hatred of the human race, odium generis humani, as to be capable of the worst crimes. With this odium the Jews were commonly charged, but they had friends to intercede for them, particularly Poppaea, the emperor's mistress. The Christians, then, the Galileans, who lay under the same charge, offered themselves as welcome victims. Men whom an historian like Tacitus could describe as hated because of their crimes, per flagitia invisos, had been the victims of many a calumny before the dire accusation of having burned the city was brought against them. And, as they had been calumniated before, this new story did not seem credible to the enraged people. With this view, says Tacitus, he inflicted the most exquisite tortures on those men who, under the vulgar appellation of Christians, were already branded with deserved infamy. They derived their name and origin from Christ, who in the reign of Tiberius had suffered death by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. For a while this dire superstition was checked, but it again burst forth and not only spread itself over Judea, the first seat of this mischievous sect, but was even introduced into Rome, the common asylum which receives and protects whatever is impure, whatever is atrocious. The confessions of those who were seized discovered a great multitude of their accomplices, and they were all convicted, not so much for the crime of setting fire to the city as for their hatred of humankind. They died in torments, and their torments were embittered by insult and derision. Some were nailed on crosses, others sewn up in the skins of wild beasts and exposed to the fury of dogs. Others again, smeared over with combustible materials, were used as torches to illuminate the darkness of the night. The gardens of Nero were destined for the melancholy spectacle, which was accompanied with a horse race, and honoured with the presence of the emperor, who mingled with the populace in the dress of a charioteer. The guilt of the Christians indeed deserved the most exemplary punishment, but the public abhorrence was changed into commiseration from the opinion that those unhappy victims were sacrificed not so much to the public welfare as to the cruelty of a jealous tyrant. Tacitus does not state the number of the victims, nor can it be learned from any other source, but the account just read leaves the impression that it was considerable. There is no reason to believe that this fierce persecution, which seems to have lasted, with some interruptions, to the year 68 AD, extended far beyond Rome and its environs. Some historians, however, quote the words of Orosius: Romae Christianos supplicis et morte effecit ac per omnes provincias pare persecutione excruciare imperavit. He visited the Christians at Rome with torments and death, and gave orders that they should suffer like tortures throughout all the provinces. If the command was given, it must have been given towards the end of his reign, and there is no evidence that it was carried into execution. It reminds us of Herod's command to gather the elders of Judea in the hippodrome of Jericho. Nero had his worshippers after his death, and those worshippers applied to him the prophecy which was known throughout the world of a mighty ruler who should rise from the east. Among the people generally his memory was execrated, and among the Christians his image hovered in darkness for long years, as that of Herod had hovered among the Jews, and the horror of him was so great that they believed he would come again in the end of days with Antichrist, or even as Antichrist. Under Nero's three successors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, who rapidly followed one another, the Christians enjoyed rest. Under Vespasian, however, the Jewish war, which resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus, broke out. In an ancient work of Lactantius, De Mortibus Persecutororum, the Christian Cicero, as he has been called, it is shown that, for the most part, the end of the persecutors was most miserable. The death of Herod Agrippa and the self-murder of Nero not only go back to Herod the Great or even to Pilate, will at once offer themselves to your memory. But in whatever light the deaths of these men are to be regarded, there can be no question that the New Testament itself represents the destruction of the Holy City as a great divine judgment inflicted on account of obstinate unbelief. Like most divine judgments, however, it is manifestly an aspect of goodness as well as of severity, of goodness towards those who had not continued in unbelief, but had repented and been converted. Judaism, as a divine arrangement preparatory to the introduction of Christianity, had fulfilled its world historic mission. Decaying and waxing old, it was ready to vanish away. Jerusalem, with its temple at the centre of Jewish worship, had now no longer its original significance, and moreover its continued existence began to prove, and was likely to prove more and more, prejudicial to Christianity. As those of the chosen people that believed did not make haste to go out, but continued to observe many of the old rites, the breach between the Jewish and Gentile Christians, which had not been thoroughly and permanently healed by the decision recorded in Acts 15, threatened to become alarmingly wide. In point of fact, it did not become, with the extreme Judaizing party, irreparable. On the other hand, where, without a deep attachment to the gospel in its simplicity, there was a strong desire to prevent alienation and separation, there was the danger of impurity and corruption from the admixture of elements that had not been designed for perpetuity. The destruction, therefore, predicted by the Saviour himself, when the temple rebuilt by Herod stood in all its magnificence and glory, was a most important event in its bearing on the future progress and prosperity of the Church of Christ. The mystery of a universal religion, which had been hid from ages and generations, but was made known in due time, chiefly by the Apostle Paul, still remaining a mystery to the bulk of the Jewish nation, only rendered their particularism more odious, more passionate, and more intolerable. In the church founded by the ignominiously rejected Jesus, they saw a new obstruction to the fulfillment of their messianic hopes. But vengeance on the Jewish nation had begun before the Jewish war broke out, particularly under the procurator Gessius Florus, who appears to have been as great a monster as his master in the capital. The whips of his predecessor Albinus were now changed to scorpions, and it is not wonderful that the Jews, numbers of whom had formerly risen with far less cause, were now maddened to revolt. While we may recognise the righteousness of God in the final judgment, we are, of course, free to judge of the instruments by which his wrath came upon them to the uttermost. Duravit patientia Judaeis usque ad Gessium Florum procuratorum. Patience lasted the Jews till the time of Gessius Florus, says Tacitus expressively enough after his own manner. The patientia could not but become furor, madness. Among other things, it is related of Gessius Florus that, for a share of the plunder of a city, he granted impunity to the banditti who invested Judea, and, what is vastly more revolting, that he deliberately excited a tumult and ordered a massacre at Jerusalem, in which 3,600 perished, merely to afford him, amidst the confusion, an opportunity of plundering the temple. Again, and this, if not so shocking, was hardly less calculated to infuriate, when, at the feast of the Passover, AD 65, the Jews petitioned Gallus, the proconsul of Syria, who was then in Jerusalem, against the tyranny of Florus. The latter stood laughing at the petitioners by the side of his superior, who showed no great disposition to redress their wrongs, and who further ostentatiously escorted Florus to Antioch. Josephus expressly says that Florus purposely kindled a rebellion in order to cover his crimes. It broke out in the 12th year of the reign of Nero. The Jews, under the leadership of a certain Manahem, the son of Judas, took the fortress of Antonina by storm and slew its Roman garrison. On the other hand, the Gentile inhabitants of Caesarea fell upon the Jewish part of the population and murdered them by thousands. To revenge the death of their brethren in Caesarea and in other places where similar massacres took place, multitudes of Jews banded together and invaded the Syrian territory, devastating several towns and slaying the inhabitants. Then the proconsul, Cestius Gallus, advanced with a well-equipped army against the rebels, appeared before Jerusalem, and, having made himself the master of the northern part of the city, departed in the most unaccountable manner, when, according to the Jewish historian, he might have finished the war at once. As he was seriously harassed by the Jews on the way, his retreat became a flight, and his forces were greatly diminished, a result which enraged Nero, led to the appointment of Vespasian, and, it would seem, proved fatal to Gallus himself, who died before the arrival of his successor, having sunk, it is supposed, under vexation and grief. Once more the Jewish people were for a time free, but they had lost the power of self-government, and the sufferings caused by anarchy and fanaticism exceeded all that had been endured under the Romans. The whole land, and Galilee especially, was desolated by bands of robbers, the wildest and most shameless. Under leaders at once cunning and daring, these gangs plundered towns and villages, till they began to find this kind of work tame and tedious, and the chief robbers united their forces and entered Jerusalem itself, where they made themselves masters of the temple, and robbed and murdered on all sides. The exact time at which the Christians, remembering the word of their Lord, fled beyond Jordan to Pella in Perea, it is scarcely possible to ascertain, but it must have been between the date of the retreat of Gallus and the last period of the war, when the city was closely invested. Over the carcass from which the breath of a divine life had fled, and in which no pulse beat for repentance and renewal, the eagles were now gathering, flying round it in circles, becoming narrower and narrower. But meanwhile the Lord put his dove, his church, in a safe retreat. The account of Eusebius is simply that the Christians, obeying the divine warning, departed, and that after their departure the vengeance of heaven burst forth over the godless city. Pella is described as a peaceful oasis, lying on the great road to Damascus, but hidden behind hills and surrounded with murmuring brooks and shady groves. It is not necessary to suppose, however, that the Christians, as soon as they knew that the abomination of desolation stood in the holy place, all fled on the same day or in the same season of the year. But if any of them fled on the Sabbath day, They had too much reason to fear that no hand would be stretched out to relieve them, no arm to help them, and, especially, if they carried any burden with them, might they apprehend the most cruel treatment as breakers of the fourth commandment. If, again, they attempted to flee in the winter or rainy season, what would they do in the swellings of the Jordan, which had to be crossed before the place prepared of God could be reached? Josephus describes the fate of a multitude of Jewish fugitives, not Christians, in language that throws a fearful light on the words of the Lord, "Pray ye that your flight be not in the winter." A Roman officer with his horsemen followed them as far as Jordan, slaying all that he overtook, and when he had driven the whole multitude to the riverside, where they were stopped by the current, lately increased by rains and not fordable, he put his soldiers in array over against them. The necessity of the fugitives provoked them to hazard a battle, because there was no place whither they could flee. They then extended themselves a very great way along the banks of the river, and sustained the darts that were thrown at them, as well as the attacks of the horsemen, who beat many of them and pushed them into the current. At this fight 15,000 of them were slain, while the number of those that were unwillingly forced to leap into Jordan was prodigious. Here was a danger against which the little community of believers had been warned, and which, we may say, speaking of it generally, it had escaped. Some have supposed that, at whatever date the Apocalypse was written, we are to see in the imagery that pictures the escape of the woman the very day on which so many of the Jews perished. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time, and times, and half a time, from the face of the serpent. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth, and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which kept the commandments of God, and had the testimony of Jesus Christ. But to return to the war, the horrors of which did not reach the little community in Pella except by report, the Jews had now to do, not with a man like Gallus or Florus, but with a man whose military reputation was second to none in the empire, a man who was already great, and who soon heard prophetic whispers that he was to be greater hereafter. This was Vespasian. Nero did not love him. On not a few things did the emperor pride himself, but there was nothing on which he prided himself more than his voice, which, however, was not musical. Vespasian, it seems, could not prevail on himself to praise Nero's vocal powers, and great offence was taken. But let Nero have his due. When things were becoming serious in the east, he knew the man, and appointed the man, who was most likely to subdue and to pacify the rebels. By the command of the emperor, Vespasian assembled a great army, more than 60,000, broke into Galilee, and took several cities. For the particulars of this Galilean war we must refer to Josephus, but a word may be said as to its general course. After the retreat of Gallus from Jerusalem, Josephus had been chosen as one of the generals of the Jews, and was sent into Galilee. The arrival of Vespasian there with his army caused such terror that Josephus himself, seeing things to be desperate, withdrew to Tiberius, and wrote thence to the Sanhedrim, urging the necessity of capitulation if they could not immediately supply him with a force strong enough to meet the foe. He had no hope of ultimate success. He had indeed, at an earlier period, attempted to dissuade his countrymen from revolting, but when they had determined to do so, he was patriot enough to make common cause with them. Sufficient help was not sent, but a feeling of honour constrained him still to carry on the struggle, and when Vespasian approached Jotapata, the most strongly fortified place in Galilee, Josephus threw himself into it and defended it for 47 days with ability and courage. It is related that, when the Romans brought up the battering ram to the wall, and when, with fearful monotony, stroke after stroke was repeated, audible through the whole town, and when the women and children ran out of their houses weeping and lamenting, all knowing well what this dreadful knocking betokened, Josephus got ready great bags filled with chaff, and when the ram was advanced, the Jews held the bags between it and the walls, breaking both the force and the noise of the strokes. But soon the Romans pierced the bags with long sickles, and the dreadful engine did its work, sending piece after piece of the wall into the depth below. When the first cohorts advanced through the breach, the Jews poured boiling oil upon them, and the Roman soldiers rolled back in agony into the valley. But the garrison was now exhausted, and a deserter let the enemy know that, in the early hours of the morning, the watchmen could not help sleeping. Accordingly, on the 47th day of the siege, shortly after midnight, the Romans advanced and took the fortress that was least of all prepared for the attack. A leaden sleep lay over the town, and a dense fog retarded the break of day. But when it was light, the inhabitants saw the thick columns of Roman troops roll down from the fortress, and after a bloody but short struggle, they were driven either into their houses or over the walls. On the second day began the slaughter and plunder within doors. Josephus was not to be seen. With 40 others he had concealed himself in a cave. His place of refuge having been betrayed by a woman, Vespasian sent to him again and again, solemnly promising his life if he surrendered. Josephus hesitated for a while, but when the Romans were becoming impatient and were on the point of throwing fire into the cave, he consented. But now the 40 fanatics, who had sought safety along with him, insisted that he should take his own life rather than go forth a slave. Each agreed to do the same. He argued and expostulated in vain. At length he fell upon a scheme. He proposed that, since they must die, they should kill one another, determining by lot who should strike down his neighbour. How the thing was managed we do not know, but according to his own account, it was Providence, and not he, that disposed. He was the leader, however, and it so happened that he was left standing on the heap of corpses with a single companion. Again he had recourse to reasoning, and now it prevailed. It was resolved to proceed no further in the work of slaughter, and they both ascended from the cave. Josephus was brought before the Roman general, and, though many cried out that he should be put to death, Vespasian was induced to spare him by the intercession of Titus, by a regard, we may suppose, to his own promise, and by the desire to send the Galilean general as a trophy to Rome. In perilous situations, Josephus was wont to foretell the future with all the confidence and solemnity of an Old Testament prophet. He had done so in the cave without producing any impression. Now he desired an opportunity of speaking to Vespasian in private, as he had a message from God to him. And when all had retired except Titus, he announced that Nero was destined to speedy destruction, and that Vespasian and Titus would become sovereigns of the world. The general asked him sceptically why he had not foreseen the fall of Jotapata and his own capture, but according to the account given by Josephus himself, he was satisfied on learning from the prisoners that the duration of the siege and the result had been accurately predicted. It is hardly necessary to say that the prophecy concerning Vespasian was likely enough to prove true, and all the more likely to prove true the more that they were to utter it. When Vespasian was declared emperor in 69 AD, Josephus, after a confinement of more than 2 years, was released, and we find him in the service of Titus, odious to his countrymen, and suspected by the Romans. Jerusalem, as we have seen, had already suffered lamentably from the intestine commotion and anarchy when, in the spring of the year 70 AD, Titus, whose father was now emperor, began the siege. On the Mount of Olives, that mount where tears had been shed over the city, the new general pitched his tent, and he too felt pity. He knew well from deserters what had already been endured in the city, and twice, before the misery had reached its height, he sent to bring the people to submission, and thus avert the bloodshed and ruin which must otherwise ensue. The first time his messenger was injured with a missile on the shoulder. The second time it was no other than Josephus that Titus employed, and he was struck on the head by a great stone, so that he fell down stunned. To the last, Titus was disposed to show mildness, but the blind resistance of the Jews was unconquerable. Worse than the robber bands within, and worse than the Roman foe without, came a third enemy, hunger. It was the time of the Passover when the siege began, and the population, including the strangers who had come up to the feast, was enormous. According to Josephus, it was nearly 3 millions, and according to Tacitus, 600,000. But even on the smaller estimate, the number was vast for the extent of the city. The horrible thing is that the savage bands within, under their leaders John and Simon, were still living riotously when those whom they had plundered were beginning to walk the streets like shadows, when mothers, ceasing to have compassion, snatched the morsel from the mouths of their children, and when many stole without the gates by night to gather herbs and grass for their nourishment, at the risk of being killed or made prisoners, or, if they returned with that miserable booty, of being plundered by others as hungry as themselves. So many fell into the hands of the besiegers and were crucified, that at last it is said that there was not enough wood for the crosses. At length, within the city, where the plague was raging, and hunger and mortality was increasing, many begged the robbers to slay them with the sword. The number of deserters to the Roman camp became ever greater, but unfortunately for them, there was no lack of provisions there, abundance coming from Syria and other neighbouring lands, and many of the starved fugitives were unable to tame the vulture within and died of excess, expiring over the first meal that they had seen for so many days. More appalling still, there were barbarians in the camp who, having learned that many of the deserters had swallowed their gold, slew 2,000 of them in one night that they might take their hidden treasures. When the fortress of Antonia had been taken, Titus was still desirous of sparing the temple and the city. Twice over Josephus was sent with offers of peace, but in vain. At length the storm came. The Jews retreated into the interior of the temple. The enemy pursued, and one of them, raised on the shoulder of a fellow soldier, cast a firebrand into the sanctuary. Titus vainly endeavoured to restrain his men. Neither threats nor blows could check their first fury. The temple was burned on the 10th of August, 70 AD, 1,130 years from the building of Solomon's. A month later the whole city was in the power of the conquerors. John and Simon, who had raged so violently and iniquitously within the walls, took refuge, as Josephus had done, in caves, but hunger forced them to come out and cast themselves on the mercy of the Romans. Neither certainly deserved mercy. The one was condemned to perpetual imprisonment, and the other was reserved to grace the triumph of Titus, which took place in 72 AD, and immediately after it was put to death. It is remarkable that in these last days, in which, according to Josephus, upward of 1,000,000 perished, both a Mary and a Jesus came into the foreground of that sad picture. What is related of the former, however, is perhaps too horrible to repeat. She killed her child in a frenzy and sent the half to those men who were the authors of the misery that had worn both her and her infant to the bone. As for Jesus, probably his reason was clouded. Jerusalem had been visited in the past, but never so terribly as now, and of this most dreadful judgment, more than of any that had preceded it, we have a full and detailed account. The long narrative of woe, such as has not been since the world began, gives sickening evidence of obstinate pride and fanaticism, as well as of grievous suffering. Long as it is, there is not a single word of a penitential crying to the Lord for his mercy. The Lord, this is the testimony of the Jew who described the judgment upon his own nation, had smitten the people with blindness. The nation spiritually had become a deep pool over which the breath of heaven did not pass. It was, to use the language of our Lord, a carcass.